managed. So joining us live from Taipei, Taiwan, the political analyst Ross Feingold, and we are going to talk about it with him. Ross, thank you so much once again for joining us here on A News and sparing your time for it.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with what is going on in the UNGA, the 18th UN General Assembly. Several countries have recognized Palestine. Let's start with that amid the ongoing Gaza genocide. How can the UNGA leverage the session to push for meaningful action and protect civilians and advance Palestinian statehood? And what is your opinion about President Trump's stance with Israel, despite many of the important countries are stating that Palestine is the one who's being oppressed here?
We have to be realistic. International criticism of Israel, the recognition of Palestine by a growing number of countries, including significant European countries that have enormous influence, whether that's political or economic or even military influence, it doesn't change Israeli policies at the moment. And Israel knows that the United States government under President Trump is backing Israel as well. So in the near term, these actions, this recognition of Palestine by a number of countries, in the coming days and weeks, it's probably very unlikely to change any of the situation on the ground as Israel continues its assault into Gaza City. And unfortunately, that's going to mean civilian deaths and casualties for sure. But again, the Israeli government's policy is very clear and international criticism doesn't affect it.
Well, President Trump delivered a provocative speech at the UNGA, as I was mentioning before, about his statements and criticizing European immigration policies and climate change initiatives. And he doesn't believe in climate change. Let's also highlight that. So do you assess the international response to his remarks? And what implications might they have for U.S. foreign relations? Do you think that it is going to be up for President Trump? The optics that he wants is going to be his, or do you think that he's going to be even more criticized?
It's probably going to be the latter, because most leaders around the world, including in the Western world, they disagree with some of the things that President Trump said, especially with regard to energy. The trend in Europe, as well as elsewhere around the world, including here in East Asia, is to make greater use of renewables, whether that's solar, wind, or other types of potential renewable energy sources. So President Trump's heavy criticism of renewables and call to return to fossil fuels, that's probably not going to go down well with most leaders around the world. When it comes to immigration, the interesting thing there is 10 years ago, this kind of message would have not gone down well in Europe. But the trend among European leaders who might even be from the left of center or centrist, not necessarily right or far right politicians, but the trend in Europe has been greater restrictions on immigration and to do more and put more pressure on those countries in Africa or the Middle East that are the sources of illegal migration. So it's a mixed scorecard for Trump. He's probably not going to get a lot of good reception on his energy comments, but his migration comments are probably going to be well accepted, even if some leaders are reluctant to directly say so. But again, their policy actions speak for themselves, and clearly the trend in Europe is to put greater restrictions on migration.
Well, both President Putin and Russia and President Xi of China were absent from this year's UNGA, but you also heard the statement that is coming from President Trump. Before we move on from the international community's stance, I also would like to ask you your opinion about President Trump's statements about Russia, because it was, again, 180 degrees of a change. He used to say that President Zelensky should stop the war and he doesn't have any leverage in him and he has to stop. He has to just deal with what he has on the hand. Now he's saying that he can get Crimea back. He can get all of the places back. So this is a huge change from the statements from President Trump. And although President Zelensky is happy with it, isn't this supposed to be taken with a grain of salt? Because he is actually changing his mind in every 3 to 5 business days. What would you say about that?
There's certainly been an enormous amount of attention in recent hours to President Trump's comments about Ukraine and the possibility that Ukraine could even recover the territories that are currently occupied by Russia, whether those territories have been occupied since 2014, like parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, or the more recent gains since the war began in 2022. But is President Trump really calling on Ukraine to launch a major offensive? Is President Trump willing to make U.S. weapons available for free? A policy that he's changed. The Biden administration made weapons available for free to Ukraine, but President Trump has put a stop to that. He's only agreed for the European countries to purchase weapons manufactured in the United States and for the Europeans to gift those weapons to Ukraine. So I think President Trump, and we should always be cautious about trying to get into President Trump's mind, but I think what he's saying here is that Russia is in a weakening position, whether that's economically or difficulties sourcing manpower for Russia's military, sourcing weapons or manufacturing weapons, that Russia might not be able to sustain this war economy and its gains on the front forever. And that could create the possibility for Ukraine to recover some of its lost territory. But again, I think we need to be very cautious about assuming that President Trump is giving some kind of green light for Ukraine to launch a major offensive, which frankly, whether it's from a perspective of manpower or weapons, it doesn't seem that Ukraine actually has that ability at the moment.
Well, when you consider it like that, what would you say about the possibility of President Putin reaching out to President Trump and their quote-unquote friendship renewed, actually? What do we expect from President Trump to act on after this? Do you think that he's going to shift from his 180 degrees once again and just say that President Zelensky what he previously said? Or do you think that he's going to stick with what he said and take back even Crimea for the Ukraine?
Certainly, President Trump has remained willing to engage in a peace process, and he's gotten a lot of criticism for that, whether that's the meeting he had with Putin in Alaska or sending his special envoy Witkoff multiple times to Moscow to meet with Putin. So for now, President Trump seems engaged and willing to be engaged in that process. Now, if Putin was to suddenly say today that he's willing to freeze the front line where it is in return for ceasefire and sanctions relief, would President Trump reject that? Or would he go to Zelensky and say, this is a good deal, just accept it now. You have to accept that the territorial gains of Russia and the territorial losses of Ukraine are going to be frozen in time for now. Which way would President Trump come down on that if Putin made that offer today? We don't know, but I think it's very likely that President Trump would still say to Zelensky, that's a good deal, you should take it.
Well, let's move on to what is going on in the UNGA also. This is probably what is going to happen, as you have mentioned, but the messages about the absence of Russian president and the presence of China, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. This non-attendance sent to international community a message. What kind of message is this, do you think, and how it might influence global geopolitical dynamics? Are we finally, after 80 years after the Second World War, are we finally shifting to a world system that stands by the other parts of the world, or are we still going to stick with the UN, in your opinion?
It remains to be seen. Russia, of course, is somewhat frozen out of a lot of multilateral organizations and has very little engagement with most European countries at the moment. The meeting with Trump was a kind of a first in many years for that level of engagement with the United States. When it comes to China, China is heavily engaged in international organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting that just occurred in China a few weeks ago that got so much attention. It's engaged with BRICS. It's engaged with regional trade agreements. So China likes to give the message that multilateralism is still a way to go and that there are multilateral platforms that are still worth investing in. I think Xi Jinping didn't attend the General Assembly because he knows that whatever he says, the Western media is going to criticize him. And perhaps that's actually well deserved, but they're going to criticize China over issues like Hong Kong or Xinjiang or Tibet or its policies towards Taiwan, where I'm speaking from. That's inevitable if Xi Jinping were to speak at the UN General Assembly. So he may have just decided it's not worth the hassle. And similarly for Putin, I don't know if the U.S. would give him a visa. The U.S. might say, this is just the optics would be too much trouble. It's not worth the hassle. Trump already had to deal with a lot of criticism for the Alaska meeting with Putin. So it's not a surprise that both countries' leaders aren't there. But are they going to continue to look for ways to engage with the international community? Of course. And we've seen that in recent months. There are plenty of leaders of countries, whether that's here in Asia, the Middle East, Africa. Plenty of leaders are willing to go to Moscow or to Beijing to have bilateral meetings.
Well, the 18th UNGA also focused on multilateralism, climate change and sustainable development. In your view, what are the most pressing issues that the UN should address to ensure a more stable and cooperative international order?
To be fair to President Trump, he was accurate when he criticized the UN's, I would call it a failure to resolve several conflicts around the world. Now, he took a lot of credit for resolving those conflicts himself, and people might want to dispute that. He was involved in resolving some of those conflicts, though. So he does deserve some credit. But I do agree with him that the UN has not been involved, whether that's Gaza, Hamas and Israel, or whether that's Ukraine and Russia, Sudan, Myanmar, Congo, and Rwanda. There's a number of conflicts around the world where the UN is not really doing what we would normally hope for the UN and its Secretary General to do. So they could talk about things like sustainability and other things that might be important, but the most pressing expectation for the UN is to be involved in conflict resolution, and it's really failing in that regard. Now, when it comes to sustainability and climate change, again, President Trump's views on that are not the trend of most countries. And there are countries in a number of places around the world, low-lying countries, for example, the Pacific island countries, that are genuinely worried about climate change and rising sea levels. They have very strong views about what other countries need to do to resolve or reduce the threat from climate change. And the UN is heavily involved in that process. And given the number of UN strong countries, whether that's the UK or France or other countries that are heavily supportive of climate change initiatives or climate change remediation initiatives, I would expect the UN is going to continue to do that, including under its next Secretary General, as we get towards the final year of Gutierrez's term.
Well, Ross, when we consider all of these, and we have been talking about UNGA for the entire week, and we are in the halfway through the week, but we will continue talking about it. So it has started. We had our kickstart. We had our first batch of speeches. What is the most significant thing that you have heard from a leader so far? And what do you expect? Who do you expect? Who do you look forward to hear the most?
I'm somewhat biased because I am an American. I think people will talk about President Trump's speech for some time to come, especially his criticisms of the UN, his criticisms of climate change policies, and his criticisms of migration. Is anyone really going to remember the speeches by nearly 200 other leaders? Chances are no. There might be a more long-term effect from some of these sideline meetings, such as the meetings that have been held with regard to the situation in Gaza. But are people really going to remember some of the speeches that got a lot of attention over the past few days or will in the coming days? For example, people talk about Brazilian President Lula's speech. It's in the news cycle at the moment. But are people going to remember it 6 months from now? Highly unlikely.
Well, President Trump is such a characteristic that we are probably going to talk about through all of the summits that he is in. But as you have mentioned, the sidelines meetings about Gaza is quite important as well. Do you think that the situation in Gaza is going to be affected for better or worse after the UNGA?
The interesting thing there is, although I've said that Netanyahu doesn't seem susceptible to international criticism when it comes to how he conducts the war, but at times, including this year, going back to, say, the March, April, May period, he seems to be susceptible to international criticism about the humanitarian situation. So if these other countries that are holding meetings on the sidelines of the General Assembly to talk about Gaza, if they focus on the humanitarian situation, because at the moment, at least today, it seems a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas is unlikely. But if there's a focus on getting more food aid and medical aid into Gaza, it does seem that Israel is susceptible to that kind of pressure, especially if these other countries could persuade President Trump that the United States also needs to put some pressure on Israel in this regard. So I want to be optimistic that there could be one change, which would be an increase in the amount of aid that gets into civilians in Gaza. But again, I don't think it's going to change the current policy of Israel to bring the fight into Gaza City.
Well, that is the grim reality that we are living in. Even the diplomacy continues back to back and people are trying to do something, the situation is quite intact in Gaza, unfortunately. And what is going on with Russia and the Ukraine has still been continuing for couple years now. So do you think in this UNGA, other countries, in addition to Ukraine and United States, are going to highlight what is going on with the Ukraine? Do you expect any change in the Russian-Ukraine situation after UNGA?
The European countries will talk about it. And to be fair to the European countries, they've remained fairly united on Ukraine-related issues ever since the invasion began in February 2022. When it comes to financial aid or military aid to Ukraine, or even discussions now about if there is a ceasefire or a peace agreement, providing troops on the ground, it seems that the European countries are willing to do that. So I think we'll continue to see the European countries talk about Ukraine. They'll talk about their commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. They'll talk about a pathway for Ukraine to join the European Union. They'll talk about the possibility of putting troops on the ground as a buffer between Ukraine and Russia. So that aspect will probably remain unchanged. But something else that will remain unchanged is there will be a number of countries from Europe that will speak out in support of Ukraine, but there's still going to be many, many countries from different parts of the world, whether that's Africa or Asia, that just won't take sides. They're not going to criticize Russia. And that's just been the reality since the war began.
Well, lastly, what would you say about the overall finalization of the UNGA, the 82 UNGA? Do you expect anything that come out concrete from it, whether be it the wars that is happening in the different regions or the climate change, or the countries who are going to have a stance, have a cooperation? We know that they have friends in Australia, United Kingdom, important countries like that have acknowledged the Palestinian state. So do you think that is any of them are going to have an impact?
Frankly, I think the UN as an organization, as well as the major countries, whether that's the UK, France, Germany, that look to the UN to be an important international multilateral platform, I think they have to be prepared for future and ongoing criticism of the United Nations from President Trump and the Trump administration. There's a new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations recently confirmed. He was there as President Trump made his speech. And he's going to be very critical. He's not going to say that the UN is great and we need to look to the UN to do more. He's going to echo President Trump's criticisms of the UN going forward. So I think the UN as an organization, or the other countries that look to the UN to play an important role, they need to be prepared not just for criticisms from the U.S., but the very real likelihood of a continued reduction in U.S. financial contributions as well.
Well, Ross, thank you so much. Thank you so much for answering my questions and sparing your time and joining us here on A News. Let's hope that UNGA and every summit that has going to happen after that has an impact positively for the international relations. Thank you.